In the mist-shrouded forests of New Hampshire, where children vanish every 17 years and church bells toll at midnight with no one to ring them, one family's bloodline carries a hunger that death cannot satisfy. Tonight, the Evergrim legacy awakens once more. The October wind of 1893 carried more than the scent of dying leaves through the dense forests of northern New Hampshire. It carried whispers, fragments of prayers, half-remembered warnings, and the kind of dread that settles into a man's bones like winter frost. Father Michael Donnelly pulled his woolen coat tighter as his horse's hooves crunched through the carpet of crimson and gold leaves. The narrow dirt road wound deeper into the wilderness, far from the familiar comfort of his parish in Whitefield. He had been summoned here by a letter written in elegant script, signed simply E. Evergrim, and bearing a wax seal that seemed to shimmer with an unsettling darkness. Father, we require your spiritual guidance. A matter of utmost urgency regarding the salvation of our family line. The old chapel on our grounds has been neglected. We fear for our eternal souls. The priest had initially dismissed the letter as another request from wealthy recluses seeking absolution for their accumulated sins. But something about the precise handwriting, the quality of the parchment, and the way the candlelight seemed to bend strangely around the seal, had compelled him to make this journey. As his horse crested a small hill, the Evergrim estate revealed itself through the thinning trees. The sight made Father Donnelly's breath catch in his throat. The mansion rose from the forest floor like a monument to some forgotten age. 3 stories of dark granite and black iron, with towers that pierced the gray sky like accusing fingers. Gargoyles perched at every corner, their stone eyes seeming to track his approach. But it was the chapel that truly unsettled him. Built into the eastern wing of the house, its Gothic spires were crowned with symbols he didn't recognize, twisted crosses that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, and windows of deep red glass that pulsed like beating hearts. "Easy, girl," he murmured to his mare, who had begun to shy and snort nervously. The very air around the estate felt thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. A figure emerged from the mansion's grand entrance, tall, pale, and dressed in black formal wear that seemed decades out of fashion. The man's face was ageless in that particular way that spoke of either exceptional breeding or something far more sinister. "Father Donnelly," the man called out, his voice carrying an accent that was neither fully English nor American, but something older. "I am Edmund Evergrim. We are grateful for your arrival." As Father Donnelly dismounted, he noticed that Edmund's feet seemed to barely disturb the fallen leaves beneath them. The man's handshake was firm, but cold. Not the chill of autumn air, but something deeper, more fundamental. "Your letter spoke of spiritual matters," Father Donnelly said, studying Edmund's pale features. "I must confess, I'm curious about the urgency." Edmund's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "The chapel, Father. It has been active. Our family has worshipped there for over 70 years, but recently, we fear our prayers have been misdirected." As they walked toward the house, Father Donnelly noticed the grounds more carefully. The gardens were immaculate but wrong. Roses that bloomed deep black, trees whose branches formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, and stone paths that seemed to lead in directions that defied the estate's actual layout. "Your family has lived here long?" the priest asked, trying to make conversation that might reveal more about his mysterious hosts. "Since 1819, Edmund replied. "My great-grandfather, Ezekiel Evergrim, built this place as a sanctuary. We have always been private people. The local villages know little of us, and we prefer it that way." They entered the mansion through heavy oak doors carved with more of those twisted symbols. The interior was a maze of dark corridors lined with portraits of pale, dark-eyed individuals who all bore the Evergrim features: sharp cheekbones, thin lips, and eyes that seemed to follow movement with predatory interest. "The chapel is through here," Edmund said, leading him down a corridor that seemed to stretch longer than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. "I should warn you, Father. Our family's traditions are old. Some might consider them eccentric." Father Donnelly's hand instinctively moved to the cross at his throat. "I've ministered to many families with unique customs. God's love encompasses all who seek it genuinely." They paused before a door of black wood bound with iron. Edmund's pale hand hovered over the handle, and for a moment his composed mask slipped. The priest saw something in those dark eyes. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of hungry anticipation. "Before we enter," Edmund said quietly, "I should explain about the stone." "Stone?" "In the chapel's foundation. It was here when we arrived, a cornerstone of sorts. My great-grandfather built around it, claimed it was blessed. But lately, we've begun to wonder if our interpretation of blessed was correct." Father Donnelly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What kind of stone?" Edmund's smile returned, but now it seemed more like a grimace. "One that remembers, Father, one that hungers, and one that has been very, very patient." The door swung open with a sound like a dying breath, revealing a chapel that defied everything Father Donnelly understood about sacred spaces. The pews were arranged in a circle around a central altar, and the altar itself was built upon a massive stone that seemed to pulse with a dark, oily light. The red glass windows cast everything in the color of fresh blood, and the air itself felt thick with the weight of accumulated whispers. But it was the walls that made the priest's blood run cold. They were covered in what appeared to be family portraits, but the faces in the paintings seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. And beneath each portrait, carved directly into the stone, were names and dates that told an impossible story. Ezekiel Evergrim, 1801, 1819. Ezekiel Evergrim, 1819, 1836. Ezekiel Evergrim, 1836, 1853. The same name, over and over, spanning decades that no single human life could encompass. "Father," Edmund said softly, and his voice now carried harmonics that seemed to come from the stone itself. "Welcome to the true heart of the Evergrim family. We have been waiting for you." Father Donnelly tried to speak, to pray, to flee, but found that his feet had become rooted to the chapel floor. The stone beneath the altar began to glow more brightly, and he could hear something moving within it. Something that had been trapped for a very long time and was now stirring to wakefulness. "You see," Edmund continued, his form beginning to shimmer and change. "Every 17 years we require a renewal. Fresh blood to feed the guardian that protects our line. And this year, Father, you have answered our call." The chapel doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and the last thing Father Donnelly saw before the darkness claimed him was his own face beginning to appear in one of the empty frames on the wall. Outside, in the village of Whitefield, the church bell began to toll midnight, though no one was there to ring it. The morning after Father Donnelly's disappearance brought an unseasonable fog that clung to the valleys around Whitefield like a shroud. Thomas Hartwell, the village's only constable, stood on the front steps of St. Mary's Church, his breath misting in the cold air as he questioned the small congregation that had gathered for morning prayers. Father Donnelly never returned from his pastoral call, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick insisted, her gloved hands wringing nervously. "He left yesterday afternoon, said he'd be back by evening prayers. That's not like him. Not like him at all." Thomas nodded grimly. At 42, he had been the law in Whitefield for over a decade, and he knew the rhythms of his small community better than most men knew their own heartbeats. Father Donnelly's absence was indeed troubling. The priest was nothing if not punctual, and his dedication to his flock was unwavering. "Did he mention where he was going?" Thomas asked, pulling out his worn notebook. "The Evergrim place," spoke up Samuel Morrison, a grizzled farmer whose family had worked the land around Whitefield for 3 generations. "Saw him heading north on the old forest road. Asked me about the way to their estate." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The Evergrim name was seldom spoken in Whitefield, but never forgotten. They were like a shadow that fell across the village's collective memory, present but never acknowledged, known but never discussed. "The Evergrims don't receive visitors," Mrs. Fitzpatrick said quietly. "Haven't for years, not since young Martha Stillwell went missing." Samuel finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was 17 years ago this month." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. Martha Stillwell had been 7 years old when she vanished during the Harvest Festival of 1876. Despite weeks of searching, no trace of her had ever been found. The case had haunted him since he'd taken the constable's position, one of several unsolved disappearances that seemed to follow a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. "I need to speak with someone who knows the Evergrim family," Thomas said. Someone who might have dealt with them before. Try old Henrik Larsson, Mrs. Fitzpatrick suggested. He's been the village historian for 30 years. If anyone knows about the Evergrims, it would be him. Thomas made his way through the fog-shrouded streets to Henrik's cottage on the outskirts of town. The elderly man answered the door as if he had been expecting this visit, his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence despite his 70-odd years. It's about the priest, isn't it? Henrik said without preamble. Father Donnelly. I saw him yesterday, heading toward the old forest road. You know about the Evergrims, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Henrik's expression grew grave. Come in, Constable. This is not a conversation for doorsteps. The cottage's interior was lined with books and papers, the accumulation of decades spent documenting the area's history. Henrik led Thomas to a large table covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that seemed to span generations. The Evergrims arrived in 1819, Henrik began, settling into his chair with a sigh. Ezekiel Evergrim and his family, wife, 2 children. They purchased a large tract of land in the northern forest, built that stone mansion. From the beginning they were different. Different how? Henrik pointed to a map marked with red ink. Look at this. Every 17 years, without fail, a child disappears from one of the surrounding villages. 1827, 1844, 1861, 1878. The pattern goes back to the year after the Evergrims arrived. Thomas studied the map, his law enforcement training making him skeptical of such patterns. Correlation doesn't prove causation, Henrik. Rural areas have always had problems with missing children. Wild animals, accidents, kidnappers passing through. That's what I thought too, Henrik said, pulling out a leather-bound journal. Until I found these records. The journal was filled with newspaper clippings, witness statements, and official reports. But it was the photographs that made Thomas's blood run cold. 7 different children spanning decades all disappeared during the same week in October, and all of them bore a striking resemblance to each other. Dark hair, pale skin, and unusual gray eyes. They're not random victims, Henrik said quietly. They're specifically chosen. And Constable, there's something else. Something that might sound impossible, but I've documented it carefully. He opened another journal, this one containing what appeared to be genealogical charts. The Evergrim family tree. I've been trying to trace their lineage for years using church records, land deeds, census data. But look at this. Thomas examined the charts, his confusion growing. These dates, they can't be right. You have Ezekiel Evergrim listed as dying in 1819, but then again in 1836 and 1853, 3 different death certificates, Henrik confirmed, all signed by different doctors, all declaring the death of one Ezekiel Evergrim. But the man described in each certificate is identical. Same height, same distinguishing marks, same age, as if he died and was somehow replaced. That's impossible, is it? Henrik's voice was barely a whisper. I've interviewed the few locals who've had dealings with the Evergrims over the years. Tradesmen, delivery drivers, the occasional lost traveler. They all describe the same thing, a family that never seems to age, that speaks in voices that carry strange echoes, and whose eyes reflect light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. Thomas stood up, pacing to the window. The fog outside seemed to be thickening, and the morning light was taking on an unsettling quality. Henrik, this sounds like folklore, ghost stories. Then explain this, Henrik said, producing a final document. It was a letter, written in elegant script on expensive parchment. This arrived at the post office yesterday afternoon, after Father Donnelly had already left for the Evergrim estate. It's addressed to you. Thomas took the letter with trembling hands. His name was written on the envelope in the same flowing handwriting, and the wax seal bore a symbol that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at it. Constable Hartwell, he read aloud. We regret to inform you that your village priest has encountered difficulties during his visit to our estate. His spiritual condition is quite grave, and we fear he may require extended care. Should you wish to discuss his circumstances, we would be honored to receive you at your earliest convenience. The chapel doors are always open to those who seek truth. Sincerely, E. Evergrim. They're inviting you to come for him, Henrik said. just like they invited him. Thomas folded the letter, his mind racing. You really believe the Evergrims are responsible for these disappearances? I believe they're responsible for something far worse than simple disappearances, Henrik replied. I believe they're responsible for keeping something alive that should have died long ago, and I believe Father Donnelly walked straight into their trap. A knock at the door interrupted them. Samuel Morrison stood on the threshold, his face pale with fear. Constable, he said breathlessly, you need to come quickly. There's been developments. They followed Samuel through the fog-shrouded streets to the village square, where a small crowd had gathered around the old well. As they approached, Thomas could see what had caused the commotion. Carved into the stone rim of the well, as if by some inhuman hand, were symbols that matched those on the Evergrim letter. But more disturbing still were the words that had been etched below them in the same elegant script. The blood remembers. The stone awakens. The cycle continues. They weren't there yesterday, Samuel whispered. I pass this well twice daily. These markings, they appeared overnight. Thomas examined the carvings more closely. The stone showed no signs of tool marks, no evidence of chiseling or carving. The symbols seemed to have been burned into the rock itself, as if by some tremendous heat. Constable, Mrs. Fitzpatrick said, her voice shaking. What does this mean? Thomas looked up at the faces surrounding him. His neighbors, his friends, people he had sworn to protect. They were looking to him for answers he didn't have, for reassurance he couldn't provide. It means, he said finally, that I'm going to pay a visit to the Evergrim estate. Tonight. Henrik grabbed his arm. Thomas, you can't. If I'm right about what they are, what they've become, then you'll be walking into the same trap that claimed Father Donnelly. Then what do you suggest? That I let them take our priest? That I wait for the next child to disappear? I suggest, Henrik said grimly, that you don't go alone, and that you prepare yourself for possibilities that your training as a constable never covered. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas found himself staring at the carved symbols on the well. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and he could swear he heard something, a sound like distant singing, or perhaps screaming, carried on the wind from the northern forest. The Evergrims were waiting for him, and somewhere in that stone mansion, Father Donnelly was either dead or wishing he were. But Thomas Hartwell was a man of duty, and duty demanded that he face whatever darkness lurked in the heart of the Evergrim bloodline, even if it meant confronting something that had been feeding on the children of New Hampshire for over 70 years. The afternoon sun struggled through the persistent fog as Thomas Hartwell prepared for his journey to the Evergrim estate. In his modest home behind the constable's office, he checked his service revolver, a Colt single-action army that had never been fired in anger, but had always provided comfort through its solid presence on his hip. Today, that comfort felt hollow. Henrik Larsson knocked on his door precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying a leather satchel that clinked with mysterious contents. The old historian looked like he hadn't slept since their morning conversation, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and worry. I've been researching all day, Henrik said without preamble. The Evergrim family history goes deeper than I initially thought, much deeper. Thomas gestured him inside, where maps and documents now covered every surface of his small kitchen table. What did you find? Henrik opened his satchel and withdrew several items that made Thomas's eyebrows rise. A silver crucifix, a small vial of what appeared to be salt, and a leather-bound book whose title was written in a language he didn't recognize. The Evergrims didn't originate in America, Henrik began. I found shipping records from Boston Harbor, 1819. They arrived on a merchant vessel called the Perdition, which sailed from a port in Romania. But here's the strange part. The ship's manifest lists them as the only passengers, and the captain's log mentions that they brought their own cargo hold. Their own cargo hold? A stone. A massive stone block that required special handling. The manifest describes it as religious artifact, and notes that it was never to be separated from the family under any circumstances. Thomas felt a chill. The stone in their chapel, most likely, but there's more. I found records of similar families in other parts of the world, always the same pattern. They arrive in isolated communities, build around an ancient stone, and children begin disappearing in 17-year cycles. Henrik opened the ancient book, revealing pages covered in symbols that seemed to writhe on the parchment. This is a journal kept by a Romanian priest named Father Comnenos. He encountered a family matching the Evergrim description in the Carpathian Mountains during the 1780s. According to his account, they weren't simply murderers or cultists. Then what were they? Vessels, Henrik said quietly. Containers for something that existed long before human civilization. Father Komnenos called it the hunger that walks, an entity that feeds on innocence and youth, but can only sustain itself through human intermediaries. Thomas stood up, pacing to the window. The fog had thickened further, and the evening shadows were coming earlier than they should. Henrik, you're asking me to believe in monsters. I'm asking you to believe in something that has been documented across cultures and centuries. Every 17 years, the entity requires renewal, fresh blood to sustain its existence. The Evergrims provide that blood, and in return, they are granted extended life and protection. But not immortality, no. They age eventually. But when one generation grows too old to serve effectively, the entity transfers its essence to a new host, always keeping the Evergrim name, always maintaining the bloodline. Thomas turned back to his friend. And you think this is what happened to Father Donnelly? I think Father Donnelly was specifically chosen, a man of faith, spiritually strong, mentally resilient, the perfect vessel for the entity to inhabit if its current host is failing. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. You're saying they're going to use him to, what? Create a new Evergrim or replace the current one? The entity doesn't care about human individuality, only about maintaining its feeding cycle and its earthly anchor. A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas opened it to find Samuel Morrison, accompanied by two other men Thomas recognized from the village, Marcus Webb, the blacksmith, and Joseph Crane, whose daughter had been one of the missing children from decades past. "Constable," Samuel said, "we've come to volunteer." "Volunteer for what?" "To go with you to the Evergrim place," Marcus said, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Henrik's been talking to folks around town, explaining what he's learned. We figure if there's a chance Father Donnelly is still alive, we owe it to him to try." Joseph Crane stepped forward, his weathered face etched with pain that had never fully healed. "My Rebecca was taken in 1861. She was only 6 years old, Constable. If there's a chance to finally get answers, to finally get justice." Thomas looked at the three men, seeing the determination in their eyes. They were afraid, he could sense that, but they were also angry. Angry at years of unanswered questions, at children who had vanished into the forest, at a darkness that had lurked at the edge of their community for too long. "This isn't a job for civilians," Thomas said. "I can't ask you to risk your lives." "You're not asking," Marcus replied. "We're volunteering. And with respect, Constable, you're going to need help. One man against whatever the Evergrims have become, that's not good odds." Henrik nodded approvingly. "There's strength in numbers, and if my research is correct, the entity draws its power from isolation and secrecy. The more people who know the truth, the weaker it becomes." As the afternoon wore on, their small group grew. Mrs. Fitzpatrick arrived with her late husband's hunting rifle and a steely determination that belied her grandmother's appearance. Dr. Harrison Wells, the village physician, brought medical supplies and a healthy skepticism that slowly crumbled as Henrik shared his research. By evening, 7 people had assembled in Thomas's kitchen, each understanding that they were about to confront something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. "Before we go," Henrik said, distributing items from his satchel, "there are precautions we should take. Silver, it's mentioned in every account of entities like this. Not as a weapon exactly, but as a barrier. Something they find difficult to approach." He handed each person a small silver pendant. "These were blessed by 3 different priests over the past century. I've been collecting them for years, hoping I'd never need to use them." "What about salt?" Dr. Wells asked, accepting his pendant with clinical interest. "Salt creates barriers. If we can create a circle of salt around the entity's anchor point, the stone in their chapel, we might be able to contain it long enough to—" Henrik paused, his expression troubled. "Long enough to what?" Thomas prompted. "To destroy it. But that's where my research becomes unclear. Father Komnenos' journal mentions fire, but also warns that the entity can transfer to a new host if threatened. We need to be prepared for the possibility that the thing wearing Edmund Evergrim's face might not be the only one we're facing. As they prepared to leave, Thomas found himself thinking about the cycles of disappearance, the 17-year pattern that had haunted his village for decades. 7 children taken in the prime of their innocence, 7 families destroyed by loss and unanswered questions. "There's something else," Joseph Crane said quietly as they gathered their supplies. "Something I never told anyone after Rebecca was taken." The group paused, sensing the weight of his words. "The night she disappeared," Joseph continued, "I found her outside, walking toward the forest. She was different. Her eyes were empty, like she was sleepwalking. But she was singing a song I'd never heard before, in a language that didn't sound human." "What did you do?" Mrs. Fitzpatrick asked. "I followed her. Thought maybe she was having one of those night terrors children sometimes get. But she led me to the edge of the Evergrim property, right to their stone gate, and there," Joseph's voice broke, "there were others. Other children from the surrounding villages, all walking toward that house like they were being called." "You saw them enter the estate?" "I saw them walk through the gate, but the moment they crossed the threshold, they changed. Their skin became pale, their eyes turned black, and they looked back at me with expressions that weren't childlike anymore. They looked hungry." The room fell silent. Henrik's research had prepared them for many possibilities, but not for this. "The entity doesn't just feed on children," Henrik said slowly. "It recruits them, transforms them into extensions of itself." "Which means," Thomas said, "that some of those missing children might still be alive, after a fashion." The implications were staggering. If the Evergrims had been collecting children for over 70 years, transforming them into servants of the entity, then the stone mansion in the forest might house dozens of victims, all still alive, but no longer human. "We need to go," Thomas said finally. "Father Donnelly has been missing for over 24 hours. If there's any chance of saving him or any of the others, we can't wait any longer." As they prepared to leave Whitefield, the fog began to lift, revealing a sky that was an unnatural shade of purple. The air itself seemed to thicken, and from somewhere in the distance came the sound of a bell tolling midnight, though it was barely 8 o'clock in the evening. "The chapel bell," Henrik said grimly. "It's beginning." They set out into the night, 7 people armed with silver, salt, and a determination to confront a darkness that had fed on their community for generations. Behind them, the village of Whitefield settled into an uneasy sleep, its residents unaware that their neighbors were about to wage war against something that had walked the earth since before the first human settlements. The Evergrim estate waited in the forest, and with it, answers to questions that had haunted New Hampshire for over 70 years. But some answers, Thomas was beginning to realize, were more terrible than the mysteries they solved. The forest road to the Evergrim estate seemed to stretch longer in the darkness than it had that morning, when Father Donnelly had ridden this same path. Thomas Hartwell led the group of 7 villagers through the maze of twisted trees, their lanterns casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The fog had lifted, but the air remained thick with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult. Every step forward felt like pushing through invisible cobwebs, and more than once, Thomas caught himself looking over his shoulder, certain they were being followed. "The trees, Mrs. Fitzpatrick whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They're watching us." Thomas followed her gaze upward. The ancient oaks and pines that lined the road seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. But it was the way the bark seemed to shift and writhe in the lantern light that made his skin crawl. Faces, human faces, appeared to be pressing outward from within the wood, their mouths open in silent screams. "Illusion," Dr. Wells said, but his voice lacked conviction, the light playing tricks on our eyes. Henrik Larson, who had been consulting his leather journal throughout their journey, stopped suddenly. "We're close," he announced. According to Father Komnenos's descriptions, the boundary of the entity's influence is marked by changes in the natural world. As if summoned by his words, they crested a small hill and saw the Evergrim estate spread out before them. The stone mansion rose from the forest like a monument to some forgotten nightmare, its windows glowing with an unnatural red light that pulsed in rhythm with something that might have been breathing. But it was the grounds surrounding the house that truly revealed the extent of the corruption. The manicured gardens Thomas had observed that morning were now revealed in their true form, twisted sculptures of bone and gristle that had once been trees. Flower beds where black roses bloomed from soil that moved like living flesh, and pathways paved with stones that were clearly not geological in origin. Sweet Jesus, Samuel Morrison breathed, raising his rifle instinctively. Look at the chapel, Marcus Webb said, pointing to the eastern wing of the mansion. The red glass windows of the chapel were blazing with internal fire, and shadows moved within. Not the shadows of people, but of things that had once been people. The bell tower stood silent, but Thomas could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest. "How many do you count?" Thomas asked, studying the windows. 15, maybe 20, Joseph Crane replied, all moving in the same pattern, like they're dancing. Or participating in a ritual, Henrik said grimly, the 17-year cycle. If my calculations are correct, tonight is the culmination, the night when the entity feeds and renews itself. They approached the stone gate that marked the entrance to the estate. The iron bars were twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly, and the gate itself stood open as if inviting them inside. But it was the cornerstone that caught Thomas's attention, a block of dark stone carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed. "That's not local stone," Dr. Wells observed, running his hand along the carved surface. "This is something else entirely, something that doesn't belong in New Hampshire. Or anywhere on Earth," Henrik added. Father Komnenos described similar stones in the Carpathian Mountains. He believed they were fragments of something that fell from the sky in ancient times, pieces of a larger entity that humanity has been fighting for millennia. As they passed through the gate, Thomas felt a sensation like walking through a spider's web. The air itself seemed to cling to his skin, and whispers began to echo from the surrounding forest, not in English, but in a language that predated human speech. "Stay together," Thomas commanded, his hand moving to his revolver. "Whatever happens, we don't separate." The front door of the mansion stood open, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. The portraits that lined the walls were clearer now, and Thomas could see that they depicted the same face repeatedly, the face of Edmund Evergrim, but showing subtle changes across the decades. In some, the features were slightly different, as if the person wearing that face had been imperfectly replaced. "The bloodline," Henrik whispered. "It's not a family. It's a single entity wearing different bodies across generations." They moved deeper into the house, following the sound of chanting that grew louder with each step. The architecture seemed to shift around them, with corridors that led in impossible directions and rooms that were larger inside than they appeared from outside. "The chapel," Thomas said, pointing to a set of double doors ahead. "The sound is coming from there." As they approached, the chanting became clearer. It wasn't in any human language, but somehow, Thomas understood the meaning. It was a summoning, a calling, an invitation for something vast and hungry to awaken fully. Henrik pressed his ear to the door. "I can hear Father Donnelly," he said. "He's alive, but changed. His voice is part of the chanting now." Thomas felt his heart sink. If the priest had been compromised, if he had become part of the entity's network, then their rescue mission had become something far more complicated. "We need to see what we're dealing with," Thomas decided. But carefully. Marcus Webb, using his blacksmith's strength, carefully pushed one of the doors open just a crack. The sight that greeted them defied rational explanation. The chapel was filled with figures in white robes, but their faces were those of the missing children from decades past. Rebecca Crane still appearing to be 6 years old despite having vanished over 30 years ago. Martha Stillwell, her 7-year-old features frozen in time. Dozens of children all standing in a circle around the central altar. And at the center of that circle, bound to the stone altar by chains that seemed to be made of the same dark material as the cornerstone, was Father Donnelly. But he was not the man who had left Whitefield yesterday. His hair had gone completely white. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the veins beneath, and his eyes were completely black, like pools of oil reflecting nothing. "The transformation has begun," Henrik said, his voice barely audible. "The entity is preparing to transfer into a new host." Edmund Evergrim stood behind the altar, his hands raised in supplication toward the massive stone that formed the chapel's foundation. The stone was now glowing with an inner fire, and shapes moved within it, things that might once have been human but had been compressed and twisted into forms that served the entity's needs. "The blood remembers," Edmund intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the stone itself. The stone awakens. The cycle continues. Father Donnelly's lips moved, but the words that came out were not his own. "I am prepared," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "I will serve. I will feed. I will continue the bloodline." Thomas felt rage building in his chest. This was what had happened to all the missing children, to all the families that had lost their young ones to the forest. They had been transformed into servants of something that viewed humanity as nothing more than a renewable resource. "Now," Thomas whispered to his companions, "we use the salt, create a barrier around the stone." But before they could move, Edmund Evergrim's head turned toward the chapel doors with inhuman precision, his black eyes fixed on their hiding spot, and his mouth curved into a smile that was all teeth and malice. "Constable Hartwell," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly across the chapel despite being spoken at normal volume. "How good of you to join us. We have been expecting you." The chapel doors burst open with supernatural force, revealing the 7 villagers to the assembled congregation of transformed children. The young faces turned toward them in unison, their innocent features twisted into expressions of hunger and predatory interest. "You're too late," Edmund continued, his form beginning to shimmer and change. "The priest has already accepted his transformation. Soon he will become the new vessel for our patron, and the bloodline will continue for another generation." Thomas drew his revolver, knowing even as he did so that bullets would be useless against what they faced. "Let him go, Evergrim. This ends tonight." Edmund's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "This began long before your village existed, Constable, long before your people crawled out of their caves and learned to fear the dark. We are eternal. We are necessary. We are the price your species pays for the privilege of existence." Henrik stepped forward, clutching his leather journal. "You're parasites," he said firmly. "Nothing more. And parasites can be exterminated." "Can they?" Edmund asked. "Then tell me, historian, how do you kill something that exists in the spaces between spaces? How do you destroy something that feeds on the very essence of life itself?" As he spoke, the stone beneath the altar began to pulse more rapidly, and cracks appeared along its surface. Something was stirring within it, something vast and alien that had been waiting for this moment for 17 years. "The salt," Thomas urged his companions, now, while they're distracted. Mrs. Fitzpatrick and Dr. Wells began pouring lines of salt around the perimeter of the chapel, while Marcus and Samuel covered them with their rifles. But the transformed children didn't attack. They simply watched with those hungry, empty eyes, as if they knew something the villagers didn't. "You think salt will contain us?" Edmund asked, amused. "You think your mortal protections have any power here? This stone is older than your religions, older than your civilizations. It remembers when your ancestors worshipped things like us as gods." The cracks in the stone were widening now, and a sound like whispering filled the air, the voices of everyone who had ever been consumed by the entity, speaking in harmonies that transcended human understanding. Father Donnelly's voice was among them, but so were others, stretching back decades. "The children," Joseph Crane said suddenly, staring at the assembled figures. "They're not just servants. They're still alive in there, still trapped." He was right. Thomas could see it now. Behind the hunger and the emptiness, there were flickers of the people these children had once been. Rebecca Crane's eyes met her father's, and for just a moment, recognition and pain flashed across her features. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice that of a 6-year-old girl despite her decades of captivity. "It hurts, Daddy. Make it stop hurting." Joseph stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Rebecca. Oh God, Rebecca, I'm so sorry. I should have saved you." "You can save her," Edmund said, his voice taking on a seductive quality. "You can save all of them. Join us willingly, and their suffering will end. Resist, and they will remain trapped forever, watching as we take more children, more innocents, more families." Thomas felt the terrible weight of the choice they faced. Save Father Donnelly and condemn the children to continued torment, or surrender themselves and perpetuate the cycle for another generation. But Henrik had other ideas. "The fire," he said, pulling a container of oil from his satchel. "Father Komnenos wrote about fire. Not just any fire, consecrated fire, blessed by multiple faiths, fed by the accumulated prayers of the innocent. He began pouring oil around the base of the stone altar, his movements quick and purposeful. The entity draws its power from the stone, but the stone is still bound by physical laws. Destroy the anchor, destroy the entity. Edmund's composure cracked for the first time. You fool, you'll kill them all. The priest, the children, everyone it has ever touched. Their souls are bound to the stone now. Destroy it, and you destroy them. Better to die free than live enslaved, Henrik replied, striking a match. Wait, Thomas called out. There has to be another way. Some way to free them without— His words were cut off as the stone finally cracked completely open, revealing the thing that had been growing within it for 17 years. It was massive, tentacled, and covered in what appeared to be human faces. All the faces of everyone it had ever consumed, all screaming in eternal agony. The entity rose from its stone cocoon like some nightmare version of birth, its presence filling the chapel with a darkness that seemed to devour the very air. The transformed children fell to their knees in worship, their young voices raised in praise of their captor. But Father Donnelly's eyes suddenly cleared, his own will reasserting itself for just a moment. Henrik, he called out, his voice breaking through the entity's control. The binding words, page 127 of the journal, speak them now. Henrik flipped through his journal with desperate speed, finding the passage written in Father Komnenos's careful script. He began to read aloud in the ancient Romanian, words that had been used centuries ago to bind entities like this one. The effect was immediate. The entity recoiled as if struck, its tentacles writhing in apparent agony. The transformed children stumbled, confusion replacing the hunger in their eyes. It's working, Thomas shouted. Keep reading. But Edmund Evergrim was not finished. With a roar of rage that shook the very foundations of the mansion, he shed his human appearance entirely, revealing himself as another tentacled horror, smaller than the entity, but no less terrible. You will not take this from us, he screamed, lunging toward Henrik with claws that could tear through stone. Marcus Webb stepped into his path, swinging a massive hammer with all his blacksmith's strength. The blow connected with Edmund's transformed body, sending him crashing into the chapel wall. But the creature that had once been human simply laughed and began to regenerate its wounds. Physical force won't stop us, Edmund hissed. We are beyond your mortal limitations now. That was when Mrs. Fitzpatrick surprised everyone by stepping forward with her husband's old hunting rifle and firing directly into the mass of the main entity. The silver blessed bullet Henrik had prepared struck true, and the creature's scream of pain was audible across dimensions. Silver works, she said calmly, reloading. Just like Henrik said it would, the battle that followed was unlike anything any of them could have imagined. 7 ordinary villagers armed with blessed silver and ancient binding words, fighting against creatures that had terrorized their community for over 70 years. Henrik continued reading from the journal, his voice growing stronger with each word. Dr. Wells and Samuel worked together to pour blessed oil around the entity's massive form, while Thomas and Marcus provided covering fire with their silver-loaded weapons. But it was Joseph Crane who provided the breakthrough. Seeing his daughter Rebecca struggling against the entity's control, he approached her slowly, speaking in the gentle voice he had used when she was truly 6 years old. Rebecca, baby, it's time to come home, he said softly. Daddy's here now. Daddy's going to take you home. The little girl's eyes cleared completely, and for the first time in over 30 years, she was truly herself again. Daddy, she cried, throwing her arms around him. The moment Rebecca broke free from the entity's control, the other children began to follow. One by one, they remembered who they had been, their true selves reasserting against decades of supernatural enslavement. And as each child broke free, the entity grew weaker. The binding is failing, Edmund screamed, his form beginning to dissolve. The stone! Protect the stone! But it was too late. The combination of Henrik's binding words, the blessed silver, and the breaking of the entity's hold over its victims had created a cascade effect that was tearing apart the supernatural bonds that had held the nightmare together for generations. The great stone began to crumble, its dark surface cracking like an eggshell. Light poured from within it, not the red light of malevolence, but the pure white light of souls finally being set free. Father Donnelly, no longer bound to the altar, struggled to his feet. His eyes were his own again, filled with pain but also with triumph. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse but human. "The curse is broken." The entity gave one final reality-shaking scream as its physical form dissolved into nothing. Edmund Evergrim crumbled to dust, his centuries of unnatural life finally catching up with him. The mansion itself began to shake and groan as the supernatural forces that had held it together for so long finally dissipated. "We need to get out of here," Thomas called out, helping Father Donnelly toward the chapel doors. "The whole place is coming down." They fled through the collapsing mansion, the freed children following close behind. As they reached the forest road, the Evergrim estate imploded in on itself, the stone and timber and accumulated evil of decades collapsing into a crater that seemed to go down forever. When the dust settled, nothing remained but a hole in the earth and the memory of the horrors that had once stood there. Dawn broke over Whitefield 3 days after the destruction of the Evergrim estate, but it was a different kind of dawn than the village had seen in over 70 years. The oppressive weight that had hung over the community like a funeral shroud had lifted, replaced by something the residents were only beginning to recognize as hope. Thomas Hartwell stood in the village cemetery, watching as the freed children were reunited with families who had never stopped mourning them. The sight was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Parents embracing sons and daughters who had not aged a day since their disappearance, siblings meeting brothers and sisters who had been frozen in time while they themselves had grown old. Rebecca Crane clung to her father Joseph, her 6-year-old form dwarfed by his aged frame. Nearby, Martha Stillwell was being held by a grandmother she had never known, the little girl's parents having died in the decades since her vanishing. 15 children in total had been freed from the entity's control, each carrying memories of their captivity that would take time and care to heal. "How are they adjusting?" Dr. Wells asked, approaching Thomas with a medical bag in hand. The physician had been working around the clock to examine the freed children, trying to understand the physical effects of their supernatural imprisonment. "Better than expected," Thomas replied. "They remember everything, their original lives, their time as whatever they were transformed into in the moment of their freedom, but they're resilient. Children often are, in ways that surprise adults." Dr. Wells nodded grimly. "Physically, they're exactly as they were the day they disappeared. No aging, no signs of malnutrition or physical abuse. But mentally," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "they've experienced decades of existence in a state that human minds weren't designed to endure. It's going to take time to help them process that." "What about Father Donnelly?" "Recovering, but changed. His experience was different from the children's. He was intended to become a host for the entity itself, not just a servant. The psychological trauma of that level of supernatural contact." Dr. Wells shook his head. "He may never be quite the same man he was before." Thomas looked toward the small cottage where Father Donnelly was staying during his recovery. The priest had aged visibly during his ordeal, his hair now completely white and his face bearing lines that hadn't been there 3 days ago. But his eyes were clear, and his faith, if anything, seemed strengthened by his encounter with evil. "The important thing," Thomas said, "is that he's alive. They're all alive." Henrik Larsson approached them, carrying a bundle of documents and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. The historian had spent the past 3 days documenting everything they had learned about the Evergrim family and the entity they had served. "I've finished cataloging the evidence," Henrik announced. "Every disappearance, every pattern, every piece of the puzzle. I'm preparing a comprehensive report for the state authorities and the regional church hierarchy." "Will they believe it?" Dr. Wells asked. "Some will. Others will dismiss it as folklore or mass hysteria. But the important thing is that it's documented. If something like this ever happens again, future generations will have the knowledge they need to fight it." Thomas appreciated Henrik's thoroughness, but part of him wondered if the truth might be too terrible for most people to accept. The official story they had agreed upon was that the Evergrim family had been kidnappers and cultists who had held the children in hidden chambers beneath their estate. The supernatural elements would remain a secret, shared only by those who had witnessed them firsthand. "There's something else," Henrik continued, lowering his voice. "Something I discovered while researching the entity's origins. This wasn't an isolated incident." He opened one of his journals to a world map marked with red pins. Similar disappearances, similar patterns, similar bloodlines. There are at least 7 other families like the Evergrims operating around the world, all serving fragments of the same original entity. Thomas felt a chill. You're saying there are more of these things out there? I'm saying we've won a battle, not the war. The entity we faced was just one piece of something much larger, something that's been influencing human history for millennia. Destroying the Evergrim stone was a victory, but the broader threat remains. Dr. Wells looked at the map with clinical interest. These other locations, do they follow the same 17-year pattern? Most of them, but some are on different cycles. Some have different feeding requirements. The entity that possessed the Evergrims preferred children because their innocence provided a particular kind of spiritual energy, but others might target different demographics. What are you suggesting we do about it? Thomas asked. Document everything. Share our knowledge with people who can use it. Create a network of individuals who understand the threat and can respond when it surfaces elsewhere. The idea both appealed to and terrified Thomas. They had barely survived their encounter with one fragment of this cosmic horror. The thought of facing others possibly stronger or more cunning was daunting. But looking at the reunited families in the cemetery, seeing the joy and relief on faces that had known only sorrow for decades, Thomas knew they had no choice. Evil like the Evergrims thrived in secrecy and isolation. The only way to fight it was through knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act when action was needed. Count me in, Thomas said finally. Whatever comes next, however we can help others facing similar threats, count me in. Dr. Wells and Henrik both nodded their agreement. They had been changed by their experience, marked by their encounter with something beyond human understanding. But they had also been strengthened by it, bonded by shared purpose and mutual trust. As they talked, Rebecca Crane approached them, her small hand clasped in her father's weathered one. The little girl looked up at Thomas with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her apparent years. Thank you, she said simply, all of you, for bringing us home. Thomas knelt down to her level, meeting her gaze directly. You're welcome, Rebecca, but you should know. You and the other children were incredibly brave. You never gave up hope even when things seemed impossible. The thing inside the stone, Rebecca said quietly, it showed us terrible things, made us do terrible things, but we always remembered who we really were deep down. That's what kept us alive. And that's what saved you in the end, Thomas replied. Your humanity, your refusal to be completely consumed by darkness. Rebecca nodded solemnly, then brightened with the resilience that only children possess. Daddy says we're going to plant a garden. I want to grow flowers, real ones, not the black roses that grew around the stone house. As father and daughter walked away, Thomas felt a profound sense of closure settling over him. The immediate crisis was over. The children were free, and the evil that had plagued their community for generations had been destroyed. But Henrik was right. This was just the beginning. Somewhere else in the world, other families were disappearing. Other children were being taken. Other communities were living under the shadow of supernatural predators. And when those communities needed help, when other heroes stepped forward to face the darkness, they would not be alone. The knowledge gained from fighting the Evergrims would spread, creating a web of understanding and resistance that could span the globe. The war against cosmic evil was far from over. But thanks to 7 ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage, humanity had gained another weapon in that ancient fight. The sun climbed higher over Whitefield, its light falling on a village finally freed from the curse that had haunted it for so long. In the cemetery, flowers were beginning to bloom on graves that had been barren for decades, as if the very earth was celebrating the return of innocence to the world. And in the forest where the Evergrim estate had once stood, new trees were already beginning to grow from the crater where evil had made its final stand. These trees would grow straight and true, their roots drawing nourishment from soil that had been cleansed by fire and sacrifice. The bloodline was broken. The cycle was ended. The children had come home. 25 years later, October 1918, the telegram arrived at Thomas Hartwell's office on a gray October morning that reminded him uncomfortably of another October day, decades past. Now 67 and bearing the silver hair and lined face of a man who had seen too much of both good and evil, Thomas read the message with growing unease. Urgent. Children disappearing. Salem, Oregon stop. 17-year pattern confirmed. Stop need. Experienced assistance. Stop familiar symbols appearing. Stop request immediate consultation. Stop Sheriff William Morrison. Thomas set the telegram down with hands that trembled slightly. Not from age, but from the memories it evoked. 25 years had passed since the destruction of the Evergrim estate, but the scars of that confrontation had never fully healed. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that their victory in New Hampshire had been more complete than Henrik Larsson's research had suggested. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Rebecca Crane, now Rebecca Hartwell, having married Thomas's younger brother Daniel, entered carrying a tray of coffee and wearing the knowing expression that had characterized her ever since her rescue from supernatural captivity. At 31, Rebecca appeared to be a woman in the prime of life, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no human should endure. She had become Thomas's unofficial partner in documenting and investigating the supernatural threats that continued to plague isolated communities across America. "Another one?" she asked, seeing the telegram. "Oregon this time. Same pattern, same timeline." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. Henrik's network has been tracking similar incidents for decades, but this is the first time we've been directly contacted by local authorities. Rebecca settled into the chair across from his desk, her movements carrying the unconscious grace of someone who had spent formative years as something other than entirely human. "The knowledge is spreading. People are beginning to recognize the signs instead of just accepting mysterious disappearances as tragic accidents, or they're becoming desperate enough to consider possibilities they would normally dismiss as superstition. Either way, it's progress." Rebecca opened the leather folder she had brought with her, revealing documents that had become depressingly familiar over the years. "I've been corresponding with Dr. Wells in Boston. He's documented 7 similar cases in New England alone since our experience with the Evergrims." Thomas studied the reports, each telling a variation of the same terrifying story. Isolated families with ancient bloodlines, mysterious stones or artifacts that served as focal points for supernatural activity, and children who disappeared in carefully orchestrated patterns that suggested intelligence and planning, rather than random predation. "The fragments are awakening," Thomas said quietly. "Henrik predicted this might happen. The destruction of one piece of the entity seems to have stimulated the others," Rebecca agreed. "Like cutting off a hydra's head, the remaining parts grow stronger to compensate." Henrik Larsson had died 3 years earlier, but not before establishing a network of scholars, law enforcement officials, and clergy who could recognize and respond to supernatural threats. His journals and research had been distributed to carefully selected individuals across the country, creating an invisible web of knowledge that was gradually making such entities' traditional methods less effective. "We have to go," Thomas said, though the words felt like a death sentence. At 67, he was no longer the vigorous constable who had stormed the Evergrim mansion. His joints ached in cold weather, his reflexes had slowed, and his heart sometimes skipped beats when he climbed stairs too quickly. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, you're not a young man anymore. This kind of confrontation is exactly what I've been preparing for my entire adult life." Thomas's voice carried the authority of someone who had faced cosmic horror and survived. "Besides, you can't do this alone. The entity fragments seem to target individuals, isolating them before moving in for the kill. We learned that lesson the hard way." Rebecca's expression softened. She understood better than most the toll their shared experiences had taken on all the survivors. Dr. Wells had developed a nervous condition that left him unable to practice medicine. Marcus Webb had become obsessively religious, spending hours each day in prayer as if trying to cleanse his soul of contamination. Samuel Morrison had never spoken of their experience to anyone, not even his wife, and had died 2 years ago with the secret still locked in his heart. "If we're going to Oregon," Rebecca said finally, "we should bring Father Donnelly." Thomas nodded. The priest had indeed never been quite the same after his ordeal, but his encounter with the entity had left him with insights into the supernatural that no seminary could provide. He had become an unofficial exorcist and spiritual advisor to Henrik's network, traveling wherever such expertise was needed. And Mrs. Fitzpatrick, if she's willing. Her aim with that blessed silver hasn't deteriorated with age. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, now 83, remained sharp as a razor and twice as dangerous when properly motivated. She had become the network's expert on protective talismans and had personally blessed enough ammunition to outfit a small army. The old team, Rebecca said with a mixture of fondness and trepidation. Older, grayer, but hopefully wiser. We'll need to be. If Henrik's theories were correct, each fragment we face will be stronger than the last. The entities learn from each other's defeats, adapting their methods to counter our tactics. Thomas stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the peaceful streets of Whitefield. The village had prospered in the years since the Evergrim curse was broken, as if the removal of that supernatural blight had allowed the community's natural vitality to flourish. Children played in streets where their parents had once whispered about mysterious disappearances. Families grew and thrived without the shadow of 17-year cycles hanging over them. But that peace had come at a price, and Thomas knew it was his responsibility to ensure that other communities could experience the same liberation. Send a telegram to Sheriff Morrison, Thomas decided. Tell him we'll arrive within the week and contact the others. It's time to assemble the old guard one more time. Rebecca nodded and began drafting their response. As she wrote, she spoke quietly without looking up from her paper. Thomas, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about my experience with the entity. Thomas turned from the window, hearing a note in her voice that he hadn't heard since those first months after her rescue. What is it? I remember things, not just from my time as its servant, but from before, from the entity's memories, stretching back centuries. I remember other faces, other names, other places where fragments like the Evergrims have taken root. Henrik suspected something like that might be possible. He theorized that prolonged contact with the entities might leave residual connections. It's more than that. Rebecca's eyes took on a distant quality. I can sense them, Thomas, the other fragments. When they awaken, when they feed, I feel it like an echo in my mind. That's how I knew about the incidents, Doctor. Wells documented before the reports even reached us. The implications of this revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Rebecca retained some kind of psychic connection to the entities, she was both their most valuable asset and their greatest vulnerability. Does it hurt? He asked gently. Not exactly. It's more like remembering a nightmare. Disturbing but not painful, and it gives us an advantage, Thomas. I can help predict where they'll strike next when they're most vulnerable, how to disrupt their feeding cycles. And the risk to you? What happens if you push that connection too far? Rebecca met his eyes directly. I don't know. But I do know that children are disappearing in Oregon just like they disappeared here. And if my condition can help prevent that, then the risk is acceptable. Thomas wanted to argue, to protect the young woman who had become like a daughter to him, but he also understood the weight of responsibility that came with their knowledge. How many children could they save by accepting the risks? How many families could be spared the decades of grief that had once plagued Whitefield? Then we go to Oregon, Thomas said. All of us. Whatever we're facing there, we face it together. As Rebecca finished their telegram and prepared to contact the other survivors, Thomas found himself thinking about the cycles of evil and the people who chose to stand against them. Each generation faced its own darkness, its own tests of courage and faith. Some failed, allowing shadows to spread across the land. Others succeeded, pushing back the night and buying time for their children and grandchildren. He was no longer young, no longer the vital constable who had first confronted the Evergrim legacy. But he was experienced, seasoned by encounters with horrors that most people couldn't imagine. And he was not alone. He had allies who understood the stakes, who had faced the darkness and emerged scarred but unbroken. The telegram to Oregon would go out today. Within a week, the survivors of the Evergrim confrontation would be traveling west, carrying their hard-won knowledge into another battle against cosmic evil. Somewhere in the forests of Oregon, children were disappearing and families were grieving. But help was coming, help that understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The bloodline of evil was spreading, sending out new tendrils to corrupt fresh ground. But opposing it was a different kind of bloodline. Not one of birth, but one of choice. People who had seen the worst that existence could offer, and had chosen to fight it anyway. The war between light and darkness was eternal, but so was the human capacity for courage in the face of the impossible. Thomas Hartwell adjusted his badge, checked his service revolver, and prepared once more to stand between the innocent and the things that hungered for their souls. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter how many times they had to be fought. Some victories were worth winning, no matter how temporary they proved to be. And some responsibilities were worth accepting, no matter how heavy they became with the passing years. The train to Oregon would leave in 3 days. The Evergrim legacy was broken, but the fight against its kindred spirits would continue, forever, if necessary.